Hello and welcome to the first ever multi-guest show for Genre Grinder. I am your host, Gabe Powers, and with me as co-host for this spectacular look back at the horror films of the 2010s is Patrick Ripoll.
Hey, how's it going, Gabe?
It's going all right. I mean, it's a new decade. It's looking...
Good hard break point.
It's looking a little bleak right now, but you know...
By break point, I mean the Earth will crack in half.
Yeah. But, we're going to look back at the previous decade, which had some high points, and I thought was a pretty good decade for movies in general. The first thing I'd want to talk about is what the two of us think kind of defined, or at least unified, the larger picture of horror films in the 2010s. So I'll let you start.
Yeah, I tend to view this sort of thing in terms of movements where one movie gets super popular and then a bunch of movies try to cash in on it, and then eventually those movies get less and less inspired and the audience gets burnt down on it, and then that sets up the stage for something that is radically different to get popular. So the beginning of the 2010s, it feels like it was sort of in that limbo period where we weren't exactly sure what the next movement was going to be. I feel like found footage, it was still around, but it had mostly burnt itself out. That
burnt out hard too. I mean, they still exist, but as far as theatrical found footage, that burnt out hard.
Yeah, like Paranormal Activity was a legit phenomenon, but by the time you got to Paranormal Activity 2, there was a pretty hard backlash, and there weren't really any other found footage movies that hit as big. There were some that were more interesting, some more inspired. There were some that, I would say were better or whatever, but like none of them really resonated with audiences the way that first Paranormal Activity did. So you look at the beginning of the decade, especially with sort of the films that we're going to be talking about throughout this episode, and you just see a wide variety of different approaches and sensibilities and everything. And then I think sort of the first big thing that would be the first mainstream movement of the decade is the sort of insidious / conjuring. You could call it the James Wan-zing of horror, which maybe would be the second James Wan-zing, depending on how much you want to credit the birth of or the popularity of quote-unquote torture porn to Saw.
Right.
This might have been the second time he pulled this particular trick off, but this time he kind of stayed on top of it the whole time. To this day, we're still not seeing new Conjuring movies come out.
And it's a big franchise. Like, it makes money for people. Whereas Saw definitely was a big deal and made money, but I think its cultural impact definitely smaller than this. It did not last as long. They even tried to bring back Saw this later decade, and it did not work.
No. So you have this, and then almost immediately after, sort of running concurrently as like counter-programming, and this, again, this has a lot of antecedents, not just in this decade, but, all the way back to the 60s. But you have these sort of quote-unquote elevated horror, which is a phrase I hate, or like art house horror film. You have a lot of movies that had crossover appeal for people who thought of themselves as not into horror movies, the kind of people who, if they saw a movie that had a lot of jump scares or gore in it, they would say, oh, that movie was terrible, or oh, I hated that movie. But because it had instead sort of heavy atmosphere and a very, often a very easily digestible sort of central metaphor, that instead, something like It Follows, I think was maybe, there were plenty of movies that predated It Follows that you could call like art house horror, but I feel like that was the big sort of mainstream crossover where people who liked scary movies thought it was good, people who liked sort of art house intellectual movies thought it was good. It had a cool soundtrack. It just had a sort of cultural cachet that, fell directly into, the work of Peter Strickland and, Robert Eggers' The Witch, and
it made the art house, the mini majors interested in horror at the very least.
Yes, absolutely. The mini majors is a good way to sort of phrase that or contextualize that, because it is the sort of thing where suddenly A24 was making, 4 to 5 horror movies a year, but like they were quote unquote horror movies at times. I think
where something like Miramax would have shuffled all its horror over to Dimension back in the 90s.
I guess actually, if you really wanted to touch this too, the first breakthrough sort of crossover art house genre, often obsessed with sort of aesthetics of the past. The real touch point is in the previous decade, which I think the previous decade was Drive, Nicholas Winding Refn's Drive.
Yeah.
I think that movie was all, at the time, in a time that sort of predated 80s obsessions and nostalgia, that movie was sort of very fresh and very exciting. And Nicholas Winding Refn became a hot brand, kind of briefly. I feel like
yeah, almost against his own will or his own abilities.
There's a lot of hot art house directors who then find a way to sort of slightly water down their thing to sell it to a wider audience, and he definitely went the opposite route.
Yes.
So yeah, when I was looking at this list and I was looking at Neon Demon, that to me is definitely part of this sort of contingency. And my reading of the decade is very self-admittedly, it's very sort of Western focused, American focused. I'm not super familiar with movies that that came out in Asian countries, horror movies that came out in Asian countries during this time. I'm not as aware of European sort of releases as I am American. So this is, there's always a million ways to frame everything, but that's how my mind tends to frame this decade.
What I should say here is that I asked Patrick and Luana and Jim and Kristine and Tyler and Betsy, to all make up their lists of their top 5 to 10 horror movies of the decade, because I know that they're all coming from this from different angles. I know that Patrick and I tend to be closer on our tastes than I am with other people. So I thought it would be interesting to look at all these different people. And I made my own list too, and we ended up with, I don't know, it's something like, I didn't even count my own on here.
70 maybe?
It's 70 plus mine.
I see.
So it was too big. This is going to be a 2 or 3 part series. At this point of recording, I don't know what it's going to be. So I'll warn listeners now that there might be some awkward cuts. But the plan here is to talk with Patrick about the larger picture, and then we're going to put in these conversations we've had with the other people as they go along. And so there's some overlap. So I've already a couple movies that Patrick might want to talk about. I'm going to maybe not even let him talk about very much, because I talked about him with someone else and their conversation was good. So this might be a little awkward, but I'm hoping it all works out in the end. But I should say, from my point of view, I agree with what Patrick was saying there. When I was thinking about what made up the decade, I was coming to it from what made it different from the previous decade. And the previous decade was the post 9/11 decade. So it was all the big horror movies in various countries, not just America, were sort of defined as a reaction to xenophobia and war and terrorism. And a lot of them were throwing back to the 70s and the very early part of the 80s. I assume because those movies came out of war and social unrest, etc. But I also rewatched a lot of these movies recently, and I realized not a lot of them have a lot to say about war and xenophobia. They just reflect it. And I think that movies of the 2010s tended to have more to say about politics, even if most of the 2010s felt like a more comfortable time for the types of people who would be making movies, well-off people for the most part. That even though they were more comfortable films than the previous decade, they were, I think, more thoughtful of their metaphors. Whereas the metaphors, what I'm trying to say is the metaphors of the previous decade were just the metaphor. This is a movie about terrorism. This is a movie about the war in Iraq. But we're not saying anything about what that means to us.
Yeah, I think when I think about what it felt like being, at my age, I was in high school during the Bush years, during pretty much all of the first Bush term. I guess to straddle the first and second Bush term. And I was thinking about what it felt like during the quote-unquote war on terror era, which we never left, and sort of the war in Iraq and the sort of I think about sort of a lot of the similar feelings as something like Devil's Rejects, even when you look at Devil's Rejects and you try to look at it as like a strict allegory where it's like, okay, the rejects are terrorism and Sheriff Whitehall is America and these people are, like, it doesn't really work.
No.
It's not super cogent, but like the feeling is there because it is, because I think it was such an intense period of time that maybe by this point, just because we are in this like sort of forever war kind of a state, we're not feeling those those feelings about the war on terror as intensely. We're instead feeling sort of Me Too and sexual harassment and the idea of sort of, I don't know, like there's a lot of like distrust in the sort of patriarchal white male figures. Like you look at a movie like The Witch or something, I think of like that to me is a very, very much an era of American culture where we're sort of looking at the free reign white men have had over all of our lives and going, was this a good idea?
Yeah. Or something like Get Out. If Get Out had been made 10 years ago, well, it wouldn't have been made 10 years ago. It would have been about racist rednecks. It wouldn't have been about racist liberals. I think that the 2010s gave a chance to sort of explore the ideas of these things that you're talking about, the patriarchy, the white men's lead in the world, rather than just reacting to the violence.
I think when I also look at this decade, I also think about maybe just a new crop of young filmmakers who are probably just raised in an era where they are less and less sort of ashamed of having genre interests. Like there was, if you are a aspiring hip indie filmmaker in the early aughts, you probably weren't necessarily looking to make a genre movie. And I feel like if you were a hip aspiring indie filmmaker in the 2010s, you probably were. I think there's a combination of that where we have filmmakers who maybe they would be making different kinds of challenging movies, but instead they're making challenging art house, quote unquote, horror movies. And then we also have a sort of a media culture, both on social media and sort of the direction that internet, websites and stuff goes, where it all became very like think piece driven. It all became very much about hot takes, and movies, I think, especially like the past, handful of years, like have really learned that they can sort of manipulate that and they can get they can get free publicity just by sort of touching or like gesturing towards ideas. Like you even had something as, maybe the most mainstream horror franchise that's still going, like Halloween. Like Halloween suddenly became a movie that was about, generations of women banding together and fighting, trauma. And it's like, not that never existed in the Halloween series before, but like, Halloween H2O is not dissimilar from David Gordon Green's Halloween, but H2O is a Scream sort of, not send up, but it sort of exists in that Kevin Williamson universe more than it exists as a sort of a thoughtful, what does it mean to be a survivor sort of place. Whereas David Gordon Green's film is very much concerned that the audience knows that it is tackling these issues, even if when you scratch the surface, you're like, this doesn't really have all that much to say.
Right. And it's sometimes very awkward, but I think it ends up being a good thing, especially for horror movies. I really like pretty heavy-handed allegories, personally.
Yeah.
And another thing I think that was maybe bad for art in general, but good for horror movies this last decade was memification. I think that without Twitter memes and shit, I don't think The Witch would have been a hit, even remotely a hit. Yeah. I think movies like It Follows or even The Lighthouse wouldn't have had any of the cultural cachet that they ended up having had they not been memified by young people who wanted to make it into a joke.
I think that idiosyncratic and original movies sort of benefit from that because they have aspects that that people can latch onto in a way that no one is going to watch Annabelle 3 and come up with a meme for it because it is so focus tested and so mass appeal when you have like a single artist doing something weird, like,
Yeah.
you are going to be like, everyone is going to latch on to Black Phillip because that is just like a good visual idea, whether it's a good visual idea on Twitter or a good visual idea in a film.
Like for instance, if some 14-year-old only saw the Babadook because they saw the Babadook is gay memes, that's great. I'm fucking delighted that some kid who would have only seen mainstream horror or even there's so much horror television, maybe not even watch any horror films, would go see something as thoughtful as the Babadook and probably get something out of it in the long run.
Yeah, and I think probably another thing you can't underrate as far as what changed from this decade to the last decade is that streaming services gave small films a much bigger platform than they ever would have.
Absolutely.
There are plenty of really interesting indie horror movies from the previous decade, from the aughts, but like those movies kind of only were known by people who purposefully seek out those movies. Whereas on Netflix, as much as I sort of hate what Netflix has done to larger film culture, like on Netflix, the Babadook sits next to, the Avengers 2 or whatever.
Right. I guess that whereas an easy way to mark this, which is sort of a less interesting aspect, but something that I think is maybe a negative of this last decade, is how obsessed people were with nostalgia.
Yes.
And I think that the previous decade had been also very nostalgia obsessed, but it was from the standpoint of that angry 70s nostalgia. So it was so punk rock counterculture that I didn't get. It's kind of obnoxious now looking back at it. I will say, watching a bunch of 2000s, 2001 to 2009 horror movies, there is something sort of obnoxious about the way it fetishizes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Last House on the Left. But it's also, it didn't get to me at the time in the same way that the sort of Amblin 80s era thing, the whole Stranger Things vibe, is something that I got personally very sick of this decade. But it makes sense to just move it up 10 years, obsessed with the 70s. So I'm guessing this in the 2020s we'll be obsessed with the 90s. So
Finally.
I guess we'll get Scream again.
Oh, it's
basically.
my time. It's my time to shine. I'll be the one with holding all the keys, because I'll be the one knowing what specific shots in urban legends were ripped off.
and why Valentine is a secretly good movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Which just means we're going to rope back around again to found footage, because then they're going to discover the Blair Witch Project at the end of it, and we're just dig back into that cycle.
Of course, like, it's you have to sort of frame things as part of a larger conversation. But the truth is, there was sort of Scream influence on movies from this decade. Movies like Cabin in the Woods or Tragedy Girls are, in different ways, very Scream influenced. There are found footage movies still coming out. There are still,
especially straight to video and streaming. Found footage is thriving, is what I figured out looking into this. I had no idea, honestly.
Rob Zombie is making House of a Thousand Corpses still.
Yeah, it's being a Fathom event instead of an actual theatrical release, but it's still there. It still exists. His whole little universe still exists. Even after he made 2 very popular Halloween movies, he kind of went back to where he was. Excuse me. But yeah, the one last thing, I suppose, is that you were talking about that Cabin in the Woods and Tragedy Girls has, the throwback, the referential thing. I think one thing that's I could say different about the last decades of referential movies is that they are less cynical and ironic. I think that they're a little bit more willing to embrace things without that wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I think something like It Follows is very much in reference to slasher movies, but in a way that I don't think is. You said you don't like the term elevated, but I can't think of another word to say, and that it is sort of embracing that and making it part of art house, I suppose. Which is something I don't think was really happening before that. I think when the Scream, for how great Scream is, Scream had a way of making people think, the people who watched it think that Scream was better than those movies and that it was making fun of those movies, and that's kind of what people picked up on in the post-Scream kind of postmodern thing, was very cynical.
Yeah, like there's worlds difference between, you know, the fact that Scream is first and foremost a very like exciting, well directed, not just well written in terms of like, oh, the dialogue is clever, but well written in terms of like the way that certain you know, thriller sequences are staged is just like really a lot of really good ideas. But the thing that got picked up is like Seed of Chucky.
Yeah, and I also think there are certain dramatic things that filmmakers are willing to do, whereas in the 2000s this would have been seen as cheesy, as lame. Someone like Mike Flanagan is very openly emotional movies.
Yeah,
that are big dramas at their core, and I don't think that wouldn't have flown in the 2000s decade.
Yeah, and I think that sort of tracks with just the difference between, you know, just the generational shift of, you know, younger millennials and Generation Z or whatever. Like, I do think that they in general are more about just they don't have to put on a sort of veneer of irony, but to appreciate quote unquote low art.
Right.
They don't have to be like, well, we're intellectuals having a conversation about Gilligan Island or whatever. They can just openly embrace Friends, you know?
Yeah. The difference between younger millennials and Zoomers or whatever and the Gen X kids, I guess. Because everything being I think I technically count as Gen X. I have no idea. There was a lot of you're not supposed to care about anything,
right?
in that era.
Apathy was a brand, whereas I think now it's very uncool to be apathetic about what's going on.
Exactly. So that's a good generalization of the decade. So if you don't like what you're hearing, I guess stop the podcast now. I'm going to put in what I talked to Jim for about an hour about this, and I'm going to stick his my interview with him. I'm probably going to stick that right here, and then I'm going to come back with Patrick, and we're going to get into his list. Jim's list ended up being 30. I was going to scold Patrick for doing a list of 25, but then Jim handed me a list of 30, and then he changed it at the last minute too. So that's how we ended up going on for an hour.
That sounds like him.
Yeah, so I'll be right back with Patrick. I'm here with Jim Laczkowski, and the two of us are both a little under the weather, so we might sound like elephant seals with engorged sinuses that are trying to fend off rival males for a little bit of this discussion. He cheated, gave me a list of 30 films instead of 10, but that's kind of that seems par for the course for Jim.
Yeah, I tend to go the extra mile sometimes.
It actually grew 5 films over the last 2 days before we recorded. Fortunately, I had seen all but one, so we're going to go in reverse order here, starting with 10 Cloverfield Lane.
Yeah, you know, a lot of the titles on my list, I would say they contain like the element of surprise in a lot of ways. I mean, like for me, a great horror film isn't, you know, just about scares or making it like this, you know, crazy funhouse experience, but something that sort of creeps into you or invades your mind both during and after the movie. And this was one of them that I think, based on the trailer, I had no idea what to expect other than, okay, it's apparently a Cloverfield sequel, but it's not done in this in the same method as the found footage one that J.J. Abrams put together. It looked very different, and it looked, you know, like these people are living in an underground bunker together, and they all sort of go mad. And I think that setup alone, I mean, that comes up a few times on the list, both between me and Patrick, is this idea of people like in a confined space, an enclosed area, and they slowly begin to reveal their true colors. And that scenario alone, I think, just gets to me. Including, it's a mystery at the start. You don't know why John Goodman has locked her up and what's going on with the other guy. And I just think both John Goodman and Mary Elizabeth Winstead gave great performances in this, and it sort of slowly builds into chaos, and then the last 15 minutes are a little underwhelming.
Yeah. Well, this was Abrams wanted to start a series of Cloverfield movies that were basically unrelated, and this was the second one. It was a totally unrelated script that he sort of grabbed and got Dan Trachtenberg to direct, and Trachtenberg was like a sort of YouTube special effects director guy. And he kind of slapped the ending on, and I think the ending is really where it falls apart.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be there. But yeah, this movie. You were saying it's about an isolated spot. I think of that as like Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat is like the one I always go back to. But it's also like a Dead Calm, which I guess is also on.
Ooh, that's another one. Yeah, that I really liked when I first saw it. Sure.
And then it's also like all these movies are based on plays, like Sleuth and Death Trap. And I do like that kind of this could have been a play very easily. Like you could really there's so few locations.
Yeah, you almost don't need the last 15 minutes where it's all revealed.
She just escapes and
yeah. So yeah, that
okay.
It worked for me at the time, and
yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, it is.
It's pretty good. Second up is Scream 4, which I haven't seen in a long time. I remember being a little underwhelmed, but definitely entertained by it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't argue that it's probably the weakest of all of them, but I still think that...
Well, part 3 is pretty bad.
Yeah, no, you're right, but you got Parker Posey in that one, and
yeah, it's true.
There's some,
part 3 is funny.
Yeah, there's some highlights, and it's definitely funnier. I mean, again, like I think, much like Patrick, I love these movies, and again, the whodunit scenario is just really easy to latch on to, and like, oh, who's it going to be this time, and how are things going to play out, and how are they going to make this fresh, and I wouldn't say like it's entirely successful, but I thought it was fun, and certainly the reveal of who the killer ends up being, I thought was a pleasant surprise, and certainly that, I don't know if I want to give that away or not.
Honestly, I can't even remember who the killer is in the end. It's a girl who's also a fan, correct?
Yeah, and it's an actress that's gone on to become kind of a scream queen, especially when, the fact that she's like starred in all these shows like Scream Queens, and a lot of seasons of American Horror Story and things like that. So she's clearly a fan of the horror genre, and I mean, I just thought like it tries to do some sort of sloppy commentary on technology and how things have changed, and it does have moments of like Wes Craven, almost like preaching like an old man, but
yeah,
I still got into it. Maybe because my expectations were pretty low after 3, and thinking what can they still do with this franchise, and it was just serviceable, and
there's
in a good
long
way.
gap there between 3 and 4 too.
Yeah.
There's a long time for them to do things. And then I think enough stuff had changed that they could have new rules, which I seem to remember this kind of trying to put things on their heads and make it more modern.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was fun. I wouldn't defend it as high art or anything, but it was okay for what it was.
Okay, and then your next one is the one I have not been able to see. It's called A Dark Song by Liam Gavin. And what is this about?
Yeah, so this is one that I just kept hearing on like some horror podcasts, and it's like, it sounds weird, but it's very funny because once again, it's it starts off as almost like a lighthouse scenario with 2 people in a confined space, slowly unraveling while they're trying to perform like a ritual in hopes of getting in touch with a dead child. And it's interesting because it goes through all the minutia of having to do all these different things. And, it's almost like, watching a chef put together a recipe. Like this occult expert, he's a little unhinged and a little intense towards this woman who wants to get in touch with her dead son. And he does things that are very questionable, ethically, morally, and otherwise, to sort of get to, like a certain psychological level. He almost tries to break her down, and, it's not always a pleasant experience to watch this happen. But, secrets are slowly revealed, and again, there's only two main characters through this whole thing, really. But it becomes something I would say that's more fantastical than horrific, which didn't really sit well with me the way things play out, but I think the build-up and the setup is really interesting and not something I've ever seen before, outside of like, okay, it's just two people in an enclosed space trying to manipulate one another, and we've seen that before, but I think just in the context of the occult, that setup and just them doing all these different things, like obviously you got the chalk outlines on the floor, which you come to expect, but there's just like little things and like going through different books that they try to integrate into this setup, and I like all that, and I really think the characters are interesting. It's a notable horror film that I think people should check out, but I also think that it doesn't entirely play out in a satisfying way to where I'm like, oh, you started out so damn strong, and unlike something like The Lighthouse, it kind of falters a bit. But I still thought it was interesting.
Okay. Well, I haven't seen it, so I have nothing to add there. Next is the one of two movies on here that I actually don't like, was Dark Skies by Scott Stewart. Scott Stewart, before Dark Skies, was really known for his duo of Paul Bettany action movies that were sort of like comic book adaptations that weren't based on specific comics, Priest and Legion.
Oh, boy.
And this was him trying to be a little more serious, I think.
Yeah, it's silly. It's an alien invasion thriller. I mean, again, if you just... maybe it's, a little bit of a Kerry Russell bias because I really like her. But also, I did find it to be creepy. I mean, it does suffer from some of your typical jump scare moments and, like the aliens jumping out at some certain points or running up really close to the camera or things like that. It really does play like almost like a weaker Conjuring movie with aliens instead of ghosts, invading the premises. But I don't know. Maybe it is just because I find the idea of an alien invasion to be scary in of itself. I think even more than ghosts. So, and there aren't a lot of. I was looking. There's not a lot of ghost stories on my list, really. So I think that again, this is not one that I actively go back to, but I certainly found it entertaining at the time I saw it, and it definitely creeped me out. Although maybe if I went back to it, I'd find a lot more of its flaws.
One thing about it is that I assume it does have a little bit of a Close Encounters of the Third Kind vibe. And I believe Dark Skies was the title of E.T. script that was the horror script that then got turned. So I always assume they purposely had a little bit of that Steven Spielberg, like they were sort of working from there. But at the same time, they're not really. It doesn't really feel like the unfilmed Evil E.T. script. That movie still hasn't been made.
No, not for sure. Again, I'm not defending this one as amazing, but I think it still has some creepy moments. And if you want to get scared by aliens, it's here.
Next is Under the Shadow, directed by Babak Anvari. And this is one I think I was pushing you to watch because no one else had voted for it, and I really like it.
I really do too, and I thank you for letting me know about it. It's interesting because when I looked up the director, they came out with a film this year that I wasn't that crazy about called Wounds. Have you seen that yet?
No, I haven't. I haven't seen any of their work.
Yeah,
His work.
It's just... like it's got a great setup again, and I just didn't think the payoff was strong, and where it decides to go is just more like, ooh, rather than interesting. But I mean, like that premise is really good. But this one has another great premise that like you mentioned, is very Babadook-esque, and that it does this fine balance of being a horror film that's about things that maybe you're imagining, along with things that are really happening in reality.
Right.
Yeah, and it's like, obviously it takes place during the Iran-Iraq war, and a missile falls into their apartment complex, and all these strange things start to happening, and some people believe that's like they're being cursed as a result of this missile hitting there. And a lot of weird things start happening, including the little girl's doll and the whereabouts of that. Yeah, I mean, it's I would say it starts off a little slow, but once that missile hits, it's pretty consistently great, I would say, throughout, and the performances are very strong.
And similar to the Babadook, it's centered on a mother who is basically avoiding a mental block of some kind. In the case of the Babadook, it is the death of her husband. In this case, it is the entirety of the revolution in Iran, destroying this woman's dreams of being a doctor, basically. And her husband's not around. He's not dead, but he's not around. And how she interacts with her daughter, who is older than the kid in Babadook, I'm going to say, but not by much. So they're similar ages. And this one's also interesting because it has, they're technically jinn, not ghosts.
Ah, right.
Which is a cool thing because, there are evil genie movies, but we always come at it from a very European, American kind of point of view. Is seeing a jinn movie from an actual Arabic point of view, like the idea that jinn are just a thing in the lamp that grants wishes, but like evil spirits, or not even evil, but mischievous spirits is an interesting thing. And it does a great job having very minor budget. Like I'm sure most of their budget was spent on that missile and that set that collapses. But they do cool things without a lot of extensive digital effects using blankets, basically, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and a good use of Jane Fonda's workout videotapes.
Well, and I think this is also, not to get too hoity-toity, but I think this is an antidote to a lot of the 2010s, a lot of American movies where it's nostalgic for the 80s, but they're only nostalgic for the part of the 80s that affluent white people remember.
Yeah.
And the 80s really sucked for a lot of other people in the world, especially in Iran during this crisis.
Yeah, you couldn't have VHS tapes. They would
or Americanized anything, and there was two countries going at each other, and the U.S. was giving one money to attack the other. And I know that sounds familiar, but it's not like history repeats itself or anything. Felt a little on the nose to see this one recently.
It did, but it was effective for sure.
It's a very good movie. It's on Netflix if anybody wants to watch it. Next is the Maniac remake, directed by it's French, Franck Calfoun.
I haven't seen anything else. If he has done anything else.
He did a pretty bad Amityville: The Awakening. A lot of people really like P2, the parking lot movie. I haven't seen that one, but a lot of people like that one.
Yeah, I haven't seen it either, but I mean, this one is a little flawed. I mean, yeah, the point of view camera gimmick worked on me more often than not, though. I think me too, and I don't think that gimmick worked at all for the. There was that other action movie. I can't remember its name right now. Hardcore Henry or something.
Henry. I thought it was just nauseating and awful in that case, and right. I thought it worked in this case.
Yeah, no, I did too. I remember, I think Daniel Baldwin might have put this like at number one on his best of list that year, and I was like, well, okay. And I mean, I think again, it's very stylish and creepy, and it's not just like a complete copycat of the original.
No, it basically has. I mean, you can't get much more different in your casting from Elijah Wood to his name is escaping me right now.
Yeah, me too.
Their physical makeup is you have Elijah Wood is Joe Spinell.
Yes,
and Joe Spinell is huge and older and they're just physically so different. So that's one step they took, and then the other step being that it's all point of view, except for 2 shots, I think.
Yeah, just 2 shots, right? And I remember thinking, like, at the time, if Nicholas Winding Refn did a slasher, it might look something like this.
Yep. And there was that thing in the early 2010s. I think that this and Drive, and the John Wick movies all kind of brought back neon to a certain degree.
Exactly. And it probably had a very synth-heavy score.
Yeah. So that's a good 80s thing, because I think that the look really works beautifully with digital photography.
Yeah, for sure.
I think The idea behind this one was to make us consider the murders because we're in his point of view. I don't know if it works from that standpoint, but it is an interesting idea, and it's not just a gimmick. I think it goes a little beyond that. Excuse me. Then you have Lights Out. This is the short by the same director, David Sandberg. This is the short that was made into a feature length.
Yeah, exactly. And there's not a whole lot to say about it because it's just freaking scary. And, I think the short film works in of itself. And I'm pretty sure it was Patrick who told me to watch it. And then, of course, I was a little terrified to turn out the lights that night.
Yeah.
The feature wasn't bad.
It's fine.
Yeah. But I don't know. There wasn't. You couldn't really expand upon that initial creepy premise enough to make like a very satisfying movie. I think they tried their best, and it is fine in the end. But I think like the ultimate emotional catharsis at the end didn't really work for me. Like I didn't feel a whole lot for the characters as much as I'd hoped to.
It's hard to inject characters and plot into something like that.
Yeah. They did okay, but I think they were gonna make a sequel at some point, but I don't know if they'll follow up on that. It
still was listed. I was just looking earlier today when I was checking out your list. It still says they're going to have one, but it says 2020, and I haven't heard anything about it. We're already in 2020, so I don't know. Yeah, good one. Check it out. I think it's on YouTube. I can't remember.
Yeah, or Vimeo. Yeah,
Vimeo. Number 23 on your list is The Skin I Live In by Pedro Almodovar. This was 2011, so this was just in under the wire kind of situation, or over the wire, I guess, the other direction.
Yeah. A lot of these I do wish, like I mentioned before we started recording, is I wish I could have rewatched just to see how strongly they hold up. But I think this made my list or made my runners up that year, and I found it to be just an unnerving take on Eyes Without a Face.
Yeah, it's sort of Eyes Without a Face and a little bit of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Kind of.
I mean, I wondered, watching it now, maybe it would make me feel gross, even, like, I find his aesthetic very mesmerizing, and obviously his use of color and his cinematography is always impeccable. I think it was just, again, another surprise coming from Almodovar, and I felt that he worked pretty well in the horror genre, but again, I can't recall the specific details of why I responded to it so strongly, but other than I think it just creeps me out.
There's something about the tone and look of his movies that are at once beautiful and unnerving.
Yeah.
So the idea of him embracing something this close to just straight horror, I would love to see him try it again someday.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this one is problematic. It was probably even problematic in 2011.
I'm sure it was, and
it's essentially a very elaborate rape revenge story.
Yeah,
but I don't know. I don't know a lot about his movies outside of the really popular ones, so I'm not really qualified to talk about the gender politics or him or all the other stuff going on in it. But it is a very interesting and attractive movie.
Yes, for sure.
That brings us to Absentia, which I think we're going to just sort of skip over because I think Patrick will want to talk about this one. This is one of a million Mike Flanagan movies that have ended up on these lists.
Yeah, me and Patrick turned out to be the biggest Mike Flanagan fans on the planet. And we can skip over it. I just remember, like, I was watching this kind of delirious when I first got the shingles, and I was kind of like in and out of consciousness, but I kept going back to this because it hooked me so much, and I found it really compelling with great performances. But yeah, I count me in on, like, everything Mike Flanagan has done is interesting in some ways or another.
And that brings us to The Bay, which surprisingly is directed by Barry Levinson.
That's the major thing. Is like, what?
The Rain Man guy directed this weird found footage horror movie that isn't the scariest of its kind or even the best of its kind, but the idea behind it that there's an event has already happened and this person has been putting together all the footage is, I wish more found footage horror movies were actually mockumentaries, I think is what I mean to say.
That's pretty much my response to when I saw it. And I mean, I was like, Barry Levinson does this found footage horror movie? What what could that possibly be? And it did take me a couple of years to catch up with it, but I knew a lot of people were praising it. And I think just what freaks me out is, again, like a disease or an infection spreading.
Mm-hmm.
So the one thing that you can say about this is that it's icky. And it's almost like a body horror movie at times.
It's a body horror movie with a cool concept behind it that if it's not working for you in this minute, just wait a couple minutes and probably something else will happen that you like.
Yeah, I just like skin stuff. Ugh,
yeah.
I just can't. So I'm pretty sure this is one of those movies on my list that I had to turn away from or cover my eyes a couple of times because it was so gross. But and I thought he really captured the region of the country with like Maryland that I'm not super familiar with, so its attention to the environment was really good. Mm-hmm. I another one I'd like to go back to again, but I just remember going, God, this is a huge surprise coming from Barry Levinson, but also a huge surprise in that it actually did something interesting with the found footage scenario.
Yeah. That brings us to Before I Wake, which is another Mike Flanagan one, and Patrick did not pick this one, so I think we're safe to talk about it a little more.
I happen to love this one. Again, it's a personal bias, but Mike Flanagan took my own idea for a horror film in which dreams can manifest into reality. Since I remember when I was younger, I always used to think, like, during the Elm Street movies, well, what if these dreams could actually come alive, like when you're awake, to where you couldn't tell the difference anymore between dreams and reality. And I think that it hints on that a few times when like watching it as an observer going, well, is this a dream or is this reality? But with the characters themselves, what if that's their issue is like, I don't know if I'm in my dream or if I'm in reality. And so in this, like, a little young boy has that power in a way to, like, when he's asleep, weird things start happening in the house. But this is more of a lighter film. I don't think it's super scary.
No, it's almost not a horror movie, but
yeah,
it's definitely still kind of qualifies. It's like a spooky fantasy.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I could see that. It's more of a spooky fantasy with like a good, story about being a parent and father-son story too at the center. I mean, I think I just found this to be surprisingly emotionally satisfying by the end. And I think it is Jacob Tremblay, right?
In the movie?
Yeah, the little boy from Room. Yeah.
It's him.
Yeah, he's very good in this too, and I just remember being really into the premise more than anything else. I think like things with dreams in general, just that's my jam.
Something Flanagan does so well is with these family-related things in particular is he has a sense of mourning that makes the scary things feel more actually like something bad's going to come out of. In this case, if this kid hurts somebody, he's not going to be get to be a part of that family anymore.
Yeah.
To me, that's more upsetting than if Freddy gets out or if Freddy attacks this girl, she'll die and not get to be on the, the valedictorian or whatever. That to me, I react to those movies on a different level.
Sure.
Than I react. This one feels more like the consequences, because I can understand them, are more serious almost.
Yeah, when like a little boy is stricken with something and the parents are really worried for their son's safety, that always gets to me.
Yeah.
But now that I thought about it too, when it comes to dreams, a movie that should be on my list that I just completely forgot about till now is the documentary that Rodney Asher put out, The Nightmare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. That freaked me out to no end, and it's shocking that I didn't put it on my list.
It's a documentary about sleep paralysis that has recreations of people's visions during sleep paralysis. Yeah, I'm actually surprised no one. That was a pretty popular one, and I'm surprised nobody has voted for that.
Well, once again, I'd probably revise my list and put it in there.
Well, yeah, you can do that after we're done.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that for me, I was really into Flanagan because of the Haunting of Hill House series he made on Netflix.
For sure.
And this one feels like a dry run for that more than any of his other movies.
Mm-hmm.
It has a lot of the same stuff going forward.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So that brings us to The Invitation by Karen Kasuma, or I believe it's pronounced Kasuma, who had a really good last decade with Jennifer's Body as one of the better horror movies of the previous decade. This one's more of a psychological thriller than that one was.
Yeah, again, I think I think another film that might have came out this year, or I mean, the same year as The Invitation, or at least a year after, is Coherence, and that's more science fiction, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But
I've watched them both pretty close together. They're both dinner party,
right? That
horror
setup again
with a
is
twist.
Something I just gravitate towards when a bunch of people get together for an evening and weird shit starts to happen and people are trying to figure out what's going on and why. And certainly the very last shot of this is pretty remarkable in what it's saying, and
especially given how compacted everything else is. Confined. This is like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf or something, you know?
Sure.
Like, this is like with that gone wrong, but then it gets much more serious.
Another one that probably could be a play.
Yeah, easily could be a play. And it opens itself up at the end. It's a good movie, and she had another good movie. Oh, I guess it's not really a horror movie, but Destroyer was a pretty intense movie.
Yeah, no, that had some good moments for sure. I wasn't as crazy about it, but I think Nicole Kidman does her best with that premise.
So that brings us to Tragedy Girls, which is one Patrick had really high on his list. So I'm going to
give it to him.
Take that one. And after that is Climax, which I was surprised Patrick didn't have on his list. And I actually just watched the other day because I don't like Gaspar Noé movies. So I had been avoiding it.
Yeah, I understand that completely. He's not a filmmaker I would actively defend in all cases. I think it's more of, he kind of works on shock value and, a lot of things that he does I'm not 100% on board with, especially with Irreversible. But both Patrick and I were very high on Enter the Void when that came out, and I'd never caught up with his crazy sex movie that I guess everything all the sex is real, not simulated.
It was just called Love.
Yeah, I never caught up with that one. Maybe I will, but
I didn't see it.
I just thought he's just doing a porn essentially, and that I don't know if I'll ever watch it, but I found this one to be a real surprise. We talk about it on the year-end episode a little bit more in detail, but I think that just what he does, especially at the opening, is really high energy, really incredible to watch. The cinematography's, just...
Apparently it's all improvised for the most... Well, not entirely, but mostly improvised, too, which it does kind of waft along a little bit in the middle. Like, it goes too long, but I still think, considering how improvised it is, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, and at one point, like I mentioned, there's just like a little possession homage and like people contorting and freaking out, and they're all on bad acid, I think, and
it's a series of actors instead of or dancers that most of which aren't actors, so they're really acting with their bodies for most of the movie.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a long sequence where they keep cutting back and forth between different couples or different people talking that I definitely, like, my patience was wearing thin on that little section. But then once things get really crazy, it's like, oh yeah, this is full on horror, being trapped in an area and you can't get out of it, and people are freaking out in different ways. Yeah. In different areas, and it's just really messed up by the end. And I think Patrick might have mentioned is just that I don't know what sort of political or sociological statement he's trying to make about this culture at this time, even though I think this is loosely based on something that may or may not have really happened.
It was at least a urban legend that something like this happened, that a group of dancers went and they got spiked with acid and did crazy stuff. But from what I was reading, it doesn't seem like it was a verifiable thing. It's just it maybe happened.
So were you okay with this one, not being a fan of this director?
Yeah, no, I think that, and I also think Enter the Void is good for about, I don't know, 75% of its runtime. I think his movies are always too long, and I find his dirtbag provocateur thing a little exhausting. But in this case, I think it actually worked because how nihilistic he is. And the first half of the movie is pretty joyful. So you're kind of just waiting for shit to hit the fan. from that standpoint, it actually works, I think. I don't plan on seeing Love, though. Okay, so that brings us to another one that I'm surprised didn't get more votes, Suspiria, the remake, directed by Luca
Guadagnino?
This isn't another movie that is too long.
It is.
But
I can admit that that's the main quibble, and rightfully so, that people have with it. And if you trim like 15, 20 minutes out of this, it'd probably be a tighter, stronger film. It
does interesting things. Suspiria is one of my all-time favorite movies. I had no problem with them remaking it because it is such a singular movie that... I mean, there's stuff... It's not as good as the original, but there's stuff it improves on. For instance, dancing actually serves a purpose in this version. The dancing is just sort of secondary. It's window dressing in Argento's version. In this version, the dancing is part of the witchcraft, which is a great thing to do.
I didn't realize I had two dancing movies back to back, pretty much.
Yeah.
Dance horror, is that a genre yet? There should be.
Well, I mean, there's workout horror, so
okay, yeah.
You could probably count them all together. But I think this is an interesting movie, and part of me wonders if it actually maybe should be longer and broken up into like a miniseries. Like I could see this one and Widows I saw back to back.
Oh, Widows for sure.
Not a horror movie. Both of them felt too long and too short at the same time.
Good point. Yeah.
So I was feeling like they kind of needed to be. Both of them could have gotten room to breathe and maybe been better movies. I don't know.
No, that's a really good point. I would like to have seen that, actually.
I guess the difference is I know exactly what I cut out of this one, and unfortunately, it's all this stuff with what's her name and all the old man makeup.
Yeah, that's
which eventually comes into play, but not in a way that's satisfying enough to have needed to have all of it.
Right.
As far as I'm
right.
concerned.
There's a couple of like meetings they have at like restaurants that are tedious and really don't add a lot to the story.
No.
But no, I think Dakota Johnson's pretty strong in this, and obviously Tilda Swinton. And that very first death scene involving a dance is still one of the creepiest moments, one of the most
it's great.
Unnerving moments of the decade.
I'm going to take a quick drink.
Me too.
You got to stay hydrated. Keep that mucus thin.
Amen.
All right. That brings us to The Blackcoat's Daughter, which I believe is the debut of Oz Perkins as director, who was mostly writing before this, but he is also the son of... He's the lookalike son of Anthony Perkins.
Yeah, no doubt. If you want to give Patrick I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, I can take this one.
Okay, yeah, because he didn't like this one as much, it seems. So
yeah, I really did. I
like this one better than the other one personally.
Oh, interesting.
I liked the twist. I didn't see it coming.
Yeah,
and it's the kind of twist that doesn't make or break the movie, but makes it an interesting way of telling a story, I think.
Yeah, I think it was the Coen brothers who once said that, like, the job of a director is tone management, and I just think like this guy, he knows how to just capture a dread and tension and an uncertainty about what is going on and why is it going on and how is it affecting these people in really interesting ways. It's a cold movie. It mostly takes place at one university. Yeah,
it's a prep school of some kind. I can't remember if it's just a plain old prep school or what, but
yeah. But I mean, again, you have really good performances and just this. It just unnerved me. It's just like one of those movies where I'm like, what is this? What's going on? Why is this happening? And it's not one of those tedious experiences. Some people might find that about this, and I'm the pretty thing that lives in the house, but I certainly was engaged by it and like wondering what's the payoff going to be, and it's not what you expect, and then it ends up becoming more satisfying as a result. And I like this ensemble. I think the three girls in here are all really great.
Yeah, I think then this one it flows well. I enjoyed it. It is not one I'm going to be rushing back to see, but I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Yeah, original title was February, and it's one of those movies that I think like kind of juggled around the film festivals, and I think I don't know. I'll be curious to see what happens with his film this year. I think it's a Hansel and Gretel story.
Yeah.
So I hope it doesn't get lost in the shuffle or buried, and because I just give this director a chance to really break out in almost like a Mike Flanagan kind of way.
And hey, speaking of Mike Flanagan,
oh yeah,
the next one is Dr. Sleep,
rules.
Which is
this movie rules.
surely Mike Flanagan's biggest movie.
Yeah, and again,
it's still not a huge budget by Hollywood standards, but a much bigger budget. I finally saw this the other day because you put it on your list, and I'm not a person who's super attached to... Oh, the cat just jumped on the mic. Not super attached to either the Kubrick movie, and I'm not super attached to Stephen King as a writer, so I don't know if it was kind of controversial for this to take elements from both the book and the Dr. Sleep book and the Shining movie, which Dr. Sleep book was made in part to erase the Kubrick movie, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was controversial, but I think that adding the two of them together worked really well. I
certainly did, and I think everybody I've talked to, whether they're a fan of the movie or they're a fan of the book, walked out pretty happy with it. You know, and I again, walking in with low expectations, at this point, when I see Mike Flanagan's name on something, I am walking in there with pretty good expectations, but then again, I just kept thinking, well, when is this guy going to make a movie I don't like? And, you know, like there's a lot, it's a true juggling act to, you know, satisfy the readers and the fans of the Kubrick film, and also make it a very scary, entertaining, interesting movie in its own right. That, you know, yes, you could easily watch The Shining and then watch this, but it stands on its own as an interesting, weird, creepy story with those, like, you know, hippie vampires and Rebecca Ferguson just knocking it out of the park as a villain.
Yeah. I was not prepared for how much it felt like an X-Men movie.
Yeah.
It really feels like there are two groups of superpowered people that X-Men and the Brotherhood of Mutants are kind of gathering. And that was neat. And actually, I will say that the mind battles, however short they are actually more interesting in this movie than I think any of the X-Men movies. And I kind of like the X-Men movies.
Sure.
I mean that as a genuine compliment, not a you could have done worse kind of compliment.
And I know you probably already know this, but there's a director's cut coming out soon.
And if anything, it felt a little episodic, and I think that a longer version could really help.
Yeah.
And I am looking forward to rewatching it with that director's cut.
Same here.
Yeah, and I'm happy that Flanagan could make a pretty big movie without feeling like he got erased by kind of a Hollywood machine, or by the Stephen King machine, for that matter. It still feels like a Mike Flanagan movie.
Absolutely.
Speaking of the Hollywood machine, that brings us to Let Me In. Matt Reeves' remake. Matt Reeves, who directed Cloverfield.
Oh, right.
His remake of Let the Right One In. It's... personally, I'm not a huge fan of it, just because I think the original is so perfect.
Understandable.
That making a very, very good English language version of it sort of feels like a waste of talent to me when that kind of thing happens.
Yeah. Michael Haneke did that thing with, like, Funny Games. That, yes, you can make the argument of, like, well, I don't think that was necessary to do, but I think if you're a fan of the actors that are in the film, it makes it a worthwhile experience, and I think that's the case with Chloe Grace Moretz at the time. I just thought it was like, yeah, this, you know, she's really talented. But also you have Richard Jenkins here, who I was also a huge fan of, and I think that there are certain stylistic touches and moments, you know, including like a moment where the camera stays in the car as it's spiraling out of control and going into a car accident, that I just thought was like, well, I'd never seen a shot like that before, and it was something that, you know, superficial that kind of, you know, bumped it up for me in my mind as being an interesting remake. But I know people who just consider this to be the, you know, the teleported steak, you know, from The Fly kind of version of Let the Right One In. But I personally love them both, and, you know, maybe I wouldn't say that this one is as good as the original. I'm not that crazy. You know. But again, a genuine surprise. I remember I did a double feature of My Soul to Take and then this. So I wasn't very happy with My Soul to Take, and I walk into this going, oh God, what have I done to my day?
Mm-hmm.
And then I was pleasantly surprised again. That's kind of the expression of the day, apparently. It's just like a lot of these just genuinely, took me aback in good ways.
Right. Yeah, it's fine. That brings us to Raw, which is one I really wish more people would have chosen, because I chose it, and I do not. I'm so bad with name. Julia Ducournau. Anyway, Raw is, I think, the kind of this decade's Ginger Snaps.
Very good. A very good coming of age movie that's also about rival sisters and trying to find your identity while you're in veterinarian school, and but man, this just has visceral moments that really get to you, and
I think that's what it was sold on, and I'm glad more people saw it because of that.
And I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of the the what is it? The French extreme kind
of
French
extremism. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not. I can't. The martyrs and Inside and all that stuff. I just no. I guess that's kind of when I realized I do have some limits when it comes to horror.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But this one, definitely affected me in all the right ways, and I'd be very curious to see what this director does in the future.
Yeah, the violence in this is that kind of violence that is worse because you can understand it.
Yes.
People getting gutted by zombies is gross, but we're not gutted by zombies. I've never been gutted by zombies, but I have stubbed my toe.
Oh, of course.
So I understand what toe pain would feel like.
And I've bitten off a finger or two.
I've broken a finger.
Right.
I mean, I can imagine that removing one is I can imagine what that would feel like. So.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those moments in a theater where the entire audience all gasped or made a noise in unison that made it also very memorable. Sometimes watching a horror movie with an audience and they're all reacting at the same time, it's very similar to being on a roller coaster, and you just kind of have that communal feeling together, and that was one of those great movie-going experiences of the decade for me, was seeing this.
That actually is a good segue. We're going to kind of skip over. Your number 11 is Get Out.
Oh, everybody loves that movie. I don't need to talk about it.
I think it's every single list pick Get Out, which is not just one of the best horror movies of the decade. It's one of the best films of the decade.
Agreed.
I think we can all agree. So, but then your next one is one that I think I lost something not seeing in an audience, which is Don't Breathe by Fede Alvarez.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the Evil Dead remake.
Yeah, that was what he was coming off of. And then recently he did The Girl in the Spider's Web.
Yeah, so I walked into this not expecting much outside of the fact that the best thing about the Evil Dead remake was Jane Levy.
Yeah, I love her. She's great.
I've become a huge fan of hers in just about anything. And in fact, I'm watching her new show on NBC, Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, because when I saw the trailer, this looks like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, only with Jane Levy. So I'm in.
Was she the one who was in the Castle Rock series too?
Yes,
correct?
Which I should catch up with. I know people.
I didn't watch season 2 yet. I didn't like the way season 1 ended. It felt really sudden to me. But
it's funny because I obviously I love Melanie Linsky and Jane Levy, but I've yet to watch that show. I should.
Yeah, the first season has one episode that is just fantastic, where they deal with the horror of Alzheimer's.
Oh,
with
Sissy Spacek?
Yeah, there's a whole episode. I don't think this is a spoiler to say. There's a whole episode that basically retells what we saw before from her point of view.
Oh man,
that made the entire season worth watching.
Okay, basically. I'm gonna get on that. But this Don't Breathe really did work as like a nice, home invasion thriller. And yes, the audience certainly jumped at the right times. And you have like these 3 idiots breaking into a house looking for a lot of money. It's a very simple setup. And then you discover like the owner of this house is this former Marine that happens to be blind but has super hearing.
Yeah.
And a lot of quick instincts. The major downside, that kind of keeps it from being an all-timer for me comes later in the film, when it turns out that this dude happens to be a really messed up killer in his own right, I think.
Yeah.
Or
I appreciated that the ads didn't give that away.
Yeah.
But then I was disappointed by where it went. It was like Rec and Rec 2, I think, had great ads because they sold one premise and then it goes much deeper than that. So I was
Right.
kind of hoping for that out of this, but then I didn't like where this one went.
Yeah, but it does play like, a horror version of Panic Room in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I was totally on board for the entire ride. And, again, it's like it made me jump, and it, the fear of rabid dogs doesn't hurt for this experience. And yeah, I think if you just would have cut out, what he does essentially in that basement, it would have made it a much better movie. But everything else about it, I was really surprised by, and I was like, well, I hope this director continues on this path, but he really didn't. I don't know if he will bounce back or not, but
he's clearly talented. I just don't know if he has much good taste.
Yes.
That brings us to another one that I think I'm going to talk to with Patrick, because he put it very high on his list.
Yes, you should.
The Crescent by Seth A. Smith, which I think makes a great triple feature with Babadook and Under the Shadow. I'll talk about that one with Patrick in his thing, which brings us to the Babadook, which is another one everybody picked because,
yes,
again, not just one of the best horror movies of the last decade, but one of the best movies of the last decade.
Absolutely, and also with The Lighthouse, you can give that to Patrick too.
Yeah, Patrick had that as his number one, and I just saw it, and I absolutely loved it.
Me too. On a rewatch, it really bumped up, because I was like, I wasn't sure. I mean, I saw it in the theater, and I wasn't sure if I loved it, and then for some reason, watching it at home, it blew me away the second time. So yeah. I'm a huge fan of. As we'll get to, this director.
Yeah, and then Hereditary. It's another one that ended up on a lot of lists. I think it's a little lower on my list.
I can understand that.
Because it feels unfocused. It felt a little too. Maybe if I watch it again, knowing where it's going, I'll get a better experience. But
it's definitely one of those, though, that just really got under my skin throughout, and had some genuine shocks that I was not prepared for. And, even if it's a very showy performance, I still think Toni Collette is remarkable in this. And, there's certain moments that just remind me of, like, Cassavetes, with like the family dynamics going on, screaming at each other. And I think that, like, Patrick felt like those parts are pretty weak, but when it turns into, a haunted house, James Wan kind of a film, it's actually really good. And for me, like, all of it works in ways that I really I struggle with. I'd certainly not at the level that Patrick did with Midsommar.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk with him about Midsommar, because no one else voted for it, not except for me. So
interesting, yeah.
I
don't dislike it. I didn't feel that strong. I don't know, like, connection.
Yeah, I don't want to make it awkward for him, but I really thought it was great. So we'll see what happens there.
I'm looking forward to that conversation, because I'm squarely right in the middle of it, because there's things about it I really love, and then where it ends up, I still kind of was disappointed where it ultimately winds up. I don't know. I found it almost too predictable in ways that I didn't think Hereditary was. Yeah,
and that's true. Hereditary is if you go into Hereditary and you were pretending you knew where it was going, I feel like you're a liar. That brings us to what we were just talking about. I Am a Pretty Thing That Lives in, is it The House? The House, not A House. Also directed by Oz Perkins. This one's on Netflix. This was a Netflix release. Patrick will want to talk about this one.
Yes, we both really, really responded strongly to that.
Like I said, I ended up liking Black Coat's Daughter a little bit more myself, but they're very good companion pieces. Cabin in the Woods, which is another one everybody picked because it was a great movie, and it was a great dissection of tropes that hadn't already been dissected too much for us to enjoy watching it.
Yeah, it might still be my favorite thing that outside of Buffy that I think Joss Whedon has done.
It's definitely the thing Joss Whedon's done that has survived for me. I feel like a lot of the stuff, when I go back to it, I'm not as interested in it anymore. But this one, I Drew Goddard, however you say his name, clearly it deserves some credit for that too.
Oh, for sure. And his movie that he came out with last year, I believe, was actually pretty good, even though it was very long.
No, it was. I liked it. Bad Times at El Royale was entertaining. I'm glad I didn't go see it in the theater, but it was entertaining.
Yeah, I need to put together a list of either tropes or scenarios that are automatic, like thumbs up from Jim.
Yeah, from you, from Jim. Jim, thumbs up.
Yeah, like I don't really like the movie Identity very much, but anything that takes place in like hotel settings, I'm pretty much 100% on board with, and so that one worked for me, and like something like Vacancy really worked for me.
There's the Stephen King one, 14.
Yeah,
it's a number. I can't remember the number.
1408.
1408.
Yeah, that's another one. So like, yeah, hotels, creepy hotels, even something like The Innkeepers, which I know Patrick's not a fan of, but like I think you set something in a creepy hotel of some kind, or a lot of people are getting together, and you learn about different people's lives as they're entering different rooms. That's a good setup for me.
Yep. And that brings us to another one everybody picks, The Witch.
Or The Vivitch.
The Vivitch, also by Mr. Robert Eggers of Lighthouse fame. He's 2 for 2. Really strong sense of who he is as a filmmaker, but at the same time, I feel like he could do a lot. He hasn't hemmed himself in between these two movies. They're both historical, slightly fantastic horror dramas.
Yeah.
And they're both very bleak.
The Lighthouse has got a remarkable sense of humor, a dark sense of humor, running throughout it that I don't think the Witch has. I think it's pretty much dead on serious.
Well, the thing about The Witch is that the way it ends, depending on who you are, it actually might be a happy ending. I kind of see it as a happy ending.
Yeah, I think I could. Yeah,
and it's kind of funny that I think that's part of its sense of humor is that Black Phillip the goat became a sort of positive, like the Babadook did. In the Babadook's case, the Babadook is not a positive thing in the context of the movie.
Right.
The Babadook is your sense of the Babadook is someone's sense of loss and grief. It's a bad thing. But you're supposed to learn to live with it. I think Black Phillip is a good influence overall, and I think that people picked up on that, and he became kind of a mascot for the latter part of this last decade.
Yeah, and maybe the seagull from the lighthouse will become the next mascot.
Yeah, I mean, he was also clearly the good guy in that situation.
Mm-hmm. Met an unfortunate fate.
And that brings us to your number 2. I keep clicking my tongue. I got to learn to stop clicking my tongue.
It happens.
You picked It Follows by David Robert Mitchell. And not a lot of people put this either on their list or this high on their list. So I was going to let you talk about this one. It's on my list. I didn't order my list. Mine will be at the end of everything here.
Okay.
I decided not to order mine. I don't know where this would land in the middle somewhere on mine.
Yeah, there's still something about it that kind of invades me, and I like the idea of being followed is just.
Well, the idea of having to continue to move.
Yeah, that too is.
If you're being chased by Jason Voorhees, even something unstoppable like Jason Voorhees, you can get in an airplane and fly away.
Yeah,
you can't get away from it in this.
Exactly, and I think a lot of people were really harping on the logic of it and kind of going, well, you can just keep driving and outrun it forever, or
But that's terrifying. That's like a terrifying life to live where you're constantly moving. To me, that's the real existential terror of the story. Isn't that, like, if I was in that situation, I'd just give up. I would just quit and let it kill me because I'd be so stressed out by being followed.
Yeah, and then the guilt you feel if you do have sex with somebody is like, oh, guess what I just did?
Yeah.
Like, I gave you this thing that you have to deal with now, unless you pass it on, and then the next person, like, it's just, yeah, it is like an existential terror going on, but also taking this, the idea of sex and subverting, the virgin horror trope and doing something different with it, and making it about teenagers trying to survive while learning to accept death as an inevitability in some cases. But also, to me, this contains the scariest moment of all of the entire decade when that tall guy appears at the door.
Yeah.
That was the moment in the theater where it's like I just shrieked and screamed in my seat and embarrassed myself. because I knew something was coming. But when it finally did, I was like, oh, geez. And like, I felt, all the goosebumps in me erupt in that moment. So I just, for that moment, for the score, and like I said, I think a lot of people know at this point, between this director's first movie and the most recent movie, I'm just 100% on board with this director.
Yeah, I still haven't watched Under the Silver Lake. It's on Amazon Prime. So
it's divisive, to say the least.
The problem with most divisive movies is I end up coming up right in the middle, and I feel bad about it. But often I'll see something that either everybody hated or everybody loved, and I'll be like, I thought it was okay.
I could see that too often. I could see you having that response, but there's a couple of horror elements, I'll say, to Under the Silver Lake, but it's just a weird mishmash of tone that I found really satisfying, but it's messy.
And then speaking of messy, your number one pick is Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island.
So you think it's messy, eh?
I think, yeah. I think this is a great movie that is hard, that you shouldn't think about too hard, and I think that that's something that's okay.
Okay.
But if you think about it too hard, it sort of unravels its own logic, which is something that happens with a lot of twist-based movies.
It's very possible. I think this one, out of all the movies on my list, just got to me more on a psychological level. I mean, I think it's deceptive. And, it is a very simple setup and story as it goes on. And I think a lot of people focused on the twist, the quote-unquote twist, as being...
Well, yeah, fortunately, I knew the twist before I even saw the movie.
Oh, I'm
sure. Someone had ruined it from the book. I think someone told me already.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember.
It's
based on a book.
I wouldn't be surprised if some people watching the trailer just went, well, I can guess what happens.
Yeah.
And to me, that's not what the film is about. It says a lot about trauma, and what happens at the very end of this movie really, really gets to me. I mean, like, I think the whole movie's great, but then then what happens at the very last moment when the lead character Teddy ultimately decides that he would rather die, or be brain dead, essentially, than live with the horrors of war and killing his wife and what happened to his family. To me, is just it actually
it makes the movie for me, honestly.
Oh, 100%.
I agree.
100%. And like, I do think everything else is great, and there are some creepy, weird things that go on, and some dream imagery, and the use of that score with when he's having that dream with Michelle Williams and she's melting away into flames. That whole thing actually moves me. But just like the idea of him, deciding he's giving up, and he'd rather not live as an evil human being that's done evil things. That it's when you think about that, when you think about the ending, I'll say that really works on an effective emotional level. But it still gets to me to this day. It's definitely my favorite horror film of the decade. Well, knowing that, yes, if you probably break down certain things about like the way it's all playing out, maybe it doesn't hold up as strongly on a logical level.
And I would argue with anybody who says it's not a horror movie that, I suppose it's a drama, a psychological thriller, whatever. But Scorsese has made a career out of skirting that line. Taxi Driver is almost a horror movie. Raging Bull's almost a horror movie. Silence is almost a horror movie. This is the time he, other than maybe Last Temptation of Christ, I think this is the time he just absolutely embraced certain horror imagery.
Oh, for sure.
I'm trying to think of another time. Maybe After Hours has like a sort of spoof version of some of that stuff, but
yeah, to me like that plays like as like a screwball horror movie almost.
Right.
The manic energy of that, but it's also like he gets a mohawk. That's scary. Or like he gets his head, he gets it like pinned down and gets his head shaved at one point. There are moments in that are actually really, really freaky if they were actually to happen. That's a good point. Like the idea of like reframing After Hours as a horror movie is something that I wouldn't mind writing about. That'd be kind of funny.
Oh, there you go. Right, put that down on a piece of paper somewhere so you remember.
Yeah, totally.
I also think that at some point the two of us should cover just a asylum movies, because I think this movie takes some stuff from Shut Corridor.
Sure. Oh, definitely.
It even has stuff in common with total schlock, like Don't Look in the Basement, which is about a nurse that comes to work at an insane asylum and slowly realizes that all the doctors have been killed or captured by the patients, and that the patients are acting like the doctors.
Yeah. Well, that would be great. Actually, I haven't really officially put this, in writing or anything, but I'm pretty set on turning Voices and Visions into a sort of mental health movie review blog, where it's like I'm just going to write about movies that tackle psychology, and certainly an offshoot of that would be asylum horror, which would be a lot of fun to write about.
Yep. I mean, all asylum movies, even Once Upon a Time, or I'm sorry, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a pretty horrifying movie.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And book. But yeah, and I guess next time Jim and I talk, we don't have a plan for when, but we're going to cover technological horror movies. Basically, I was trying to narrow it down to mostly computers and phones and the internet.
Yeah, I'm thinking like end of February, early March would be the best time.
Might work out.
Thank you for having me on to talk about my list, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody else's picks.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
Excellent.
All right. So let's dig into what Patrick liked. Your list was ranked, correct?
I ranked it. We could do chronological as well. I have that ability here on Letterboxd to sort of sort it however.
No, I like ranked. Let's do ranked.
All right. Descending?
Yeah, let's start with Hush is your first one.
Yes.
Mike Flanagan's Hush.
So we were talking about Mike Flanagan before in terms of when we were talking about sort of the James Wanification of mainstream horror, and then the sort of more quote-unquote sophisticated art house horror that sort of ran parallel. I feel like Mike Flanagan is the guy who marries the two.
Yep, he's right in the middle.
You watch his movies, and they are both like very broadly appealing sort of, most of the time they're broadly appealing ghost stories. This is not a ghost story, but they're also very openly emotional, as you said. They're very much concerned about characters. They're very much concerned about the relationships between the characters. It's fitting that he did an adaptation of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, because that is a book that is a very scary horror novel that is absolutely lives and dies on its characters, even though his adaptation ended up being wildly different.
Well, yeah.
My number 25 is Hush, which is sort of a departure from having said all that.
It's Hush, actually, this isn't going to be, this is the worst place to start with him, I feel.
Yeah. So Hush is just a raw genre exercise. It is Wait Until Dark, but with a deaf woman instead of a blind woman. Mm-hmm. But it is about a deaf woman who lives in a sort of remote house, and there is a masked man who shows up at her house with the intention of terrorizing her, only to, when he realizes that she's deaf, he realizes that he can sort of mess with her more. So it's a home invasion, psycho killer sort of a thing. And I think on top of Mike Flanagan being a good screenwriter who writes good characters, I think he is a good director who can stage very good, exciting, scary horror, and that is what this is for me. This is purely a choice. My number 25 choice is purely just because I thought it was really exciting and fun, and it's just a good cat and mouse sort of a thing. I think it does a little bit of the trying to go for a theme as far as painting the psycho killer as this sort of he's like a weird combination of he's like a nice guy incel kind of a type almost. But I don't think any of that really works too well. I
think we're supposed to have that in the back of our heads, but he's not necessarily an actual one-to-one allegory there.
Yeah. No, it's just sort of like it's what little characterization he gets. He's not a giant menacing, man. He's not a genius. He just seems sort of petulant. But
and he's just good enough at doing this. He's not.
yeah,
He's not a. He's no Jason Voorhees.
that's what makes it fun. Is that they seem, despite despite not being able to hear, they seem pretty much evenly matched. It's fun watching them sort of trade having the upper hand. And yeah, for me, this is just a fun movie. When I made this list, I had a list of like 32 that I whittled down to 25, and there were like 4 movies that were contending for number 25. One of them was like the sequel to Unfriended and stuff like that. But ultimately, I just always appreciate a well made, scary kind of a thriller, and that's what this is.
I think for me, as someone who approached Flanagan because I had seen Oculus, but I didn't really know of him as a filmmaker other than you talking about him, and I loved The House on Haunted Hill so much that it made me want to go back and watch all these. For me, this one and Gerald's Game, which nobody else is going to talk about, so I just mention it, were the 2 weakest, but they're still solid movies. Whereas this one is a little less compelling to me overall. At least it doesn't botch its ending like Gerald's Game did.
Yeah.
But it's a similar thing where it's very confined space, and it's interesting to see him do that given the scope of a lot of his other movies that he made over this decade. And I think every single one of his movies came out this decade. Am I wrong? Feature-length ones.
He had a quote-unquote career making. He was an editor. He has directed like 2 other features that are totally unavailable anywhere that I think are probably student films or something along those lines. But as far as like what you consider his career, Absentia, which came at the beginning of the decade, was definitely his debut.
Well, you have Absentia a couple up, but maybe we should talk about that right now since it's almost like the other side of him to me.
Yes.
It's him. It's a 0 budget movie, mm-hmm. and that does make it a little hard to watch. But it's a much more Flanagan-esque movie to me.
I find this movie more admirable than a lot of movies that are higher up on my list. But yeah, the budget, the low budget aspect, just the fact that not all the performances are all the way there, and I think that it has an amazing setup. I really think the central relationship between the 2 sisters is so good. It's about a recovering drug addict who goes back to sort of spend some time with her older sister, whose husband went missing. I want to say several years ago. At that point,
yeah, it's been a while. At least 3 years, 5 years. I think it's 5 years.
Yeah, so they have a sort of frayed relationship because of the younger sister's drug habit. And they both are sort of dealing with trauma, the older sister with her missing husband and the younger sister with recovery. And they have such a good, and I do think Mike Flanagan, a skill that is underrated is a director's sort of proficiency as far as directing acting. And I think that especially when you watch a lot of low budget horror movies, you can really tell which directors have no idea how to direct actors and which directors can take actors who cost no money and don't have much of a career and be able to build something out of them. And I think, I don't want to it's not that the actors themselves, aren't responsible for their good work, but for me, the main appeal of this movie is that if it had no supernatural aspects whatsoever, I would still want to see where it went. Yeah. And then it sort of slowly folds in the supernatural in a very stylish way, as stylish as you can get, again, on like such a minuscule budget. This was actually a very early example of a kickstarted movie, which is another sort of phenomenon of this decade. So Absentia for me is extremely admirable as far as a lot of times when you see a good director's sort of first low budget work, what you see is that they have a lot of good ideas, but they don't necessarily have all of the time and money and ability to put them together into something that connects to you like emotionally. Whereas this is not the opposite, but this is a low budget, early, quote unquote debut feature that is mostly about telling a good story of, starring really compelling characters. And I just find that really awesome. And I do think it is scary. I think the places it goes with the sort of the fairy mythology is really interesting. I think the imagery of that tunnel, which I think he kind of cribbed from the Leopard Man. If I had to pick an inspiration point, I would probably go with the Val Lewton produced RKO horror film, The Leopard Man.
He does have some Jacques Turner and Val Lewton sensibilities, doesn't he? I'd never put that together.
Yeah, because Val Lewton was also someone who, as a producer at RKO would give him very sensational titles and say, here's very little money, go make a movie out of it. And then he would come back with psychosexual, super loaded, melodramas that also happen to have a monster, maybe.
Maybe. And they were also centered on women a lot of the time, too.
Yeah. So I don't think I ever, put that together out loud, but as I was sort of working through...
Yeah, I had never dawned on me either.
And I'm a big fan of Val Lewton, which is probably why it makes sense I would instantly click with Mike Flanagan. So that for me is Absentia.
Yeah, and I agree with what I agree with everything you said here, and I can see the this one and there's a couple other ones, but you could really see the kernel of House on Haunted Hill here. There's so many shared themes that I think are put together. Like, there's a thing about directors who get obsessed with certain themes, and sometimes it's obnoxious. But other times they get obsessed with a theme and they really polish it. And I think that this is a movie that just he took parts of it and kept on polishing it and making it better without it feeling like a retread. I liked it a lot.
Yeah.
I was very into it. So now we'll go back one.
My number 24, I really don't have a ton to say about Mother, Darren Aronofsky's film, other than, maybe this is just sort of indicative of my wild sense of humor. A movie that I briefly considered putting on this list, but ultimately rejected in the name of it not being quite horror enough, is Killing of a Sacred Deer.
I see. For me, that movie fucking terrified me, so I put it on my list. So we're gonna talk about that later.
All right,
but
cool.
Go on.
So for me, this Mother is a film I just kind of like super audacious, just totally unafraid nonsense at times.
And then the most heavy-handed, old-fashioned, almost stupid not even metaphor. It's just a retelling of the Bible.
Yeah, it's a movie. It's it's hard to call it a subtext because the quote unquote story of the top of it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
It only works as, this is the Bible. Oh, she is Mother Earth, But I love going to a movie theater with a crowd and seeing something that genuinely surprises me and is genuinely unafraid to just be totally off-putting to a mainstream audience. Though I will say that's not all the time. A movie that did not make my list because I really don't like it at all is Neon Demon, but I could absolutely say the same is true of that film.
Yeah.
I would say the difference for me personally is just that I found Neon Demon to be sort of very tedious and samey, whereas Mother kept finding new ways to surprise me. It gets more and more harried, and then in the moment where you think it's going to get scariest, a happy little frog hops out of the ominous room in the basement, or suddenly there's this party and it's getting very intense and it's very Polanski-esque. And of course, Polanski is a major touchstone for Aronofsky. As Black Swan, which is another movie did not make my list, but sort of made my short list. I do enjoy that. So the party scene, it feels like something from Repulsion or something, but then it just kind of goes in a silly direction where a guy's just painting the walls.
And she keeps yelling at people to stop sitting on. I can't remember if it's a sink.
It is a sink, yeah.
And that's the point where I watched this movie alone, but I was laughing so hard.
Yes.
At the sink thing.
So when I say I love to see this with a crowd, it's because there were people, especially the sort of the darker places it goes, and I guess we haven't said it on this podcast yet. I don't know if you said it in your segment with Jim, but we probably will spoil some stuff.
Oh yeah, we're spoiling things. There'll be a couple very new movies that I might try to avoid.
Sure,
but in this case, Mother, it's not
a plot twist, but it is a shocking moment, and sometimes you want to have that shock
Yeah.
sort of come naturally. But at any rate, she's pregnant throughout the movie, and then eventually she gives birth, and then a crowd of people tear the baby apart and start eating it.
Yeah.
Which is like the most obvious, but not just obvious, but like nonsensical sort of reference to Jesus. You can imagine. But like, there were people in my theater who were walking up and leaving and were just like loudly talking about how disgusted they were, and I was just cackling because I was just like it's impossible to view this as anything but metaphor at this point.
Well, it's a funny thing too, because if you watch it alone, like I did, there's a pause for gasps, as the same way that sitcoms pause for laughter, and if you remove the laughter, it's awkward. There's a pause for a gasp, and if you're watching the movie alone, there's no gasp.
Yeah.
So it's when they first kill the baby, when there's like a crunch sound.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pause. And it reminded me of a sitcom.
So Darren Aronofsky is a very pompous filmmaker, I would say, and the kind of person who would put a pause for a gasp. This is a movie that I find is fun, but I'm not necessarily think it's a genius the way Aronofsky thinks it's genius.
Exactly. Yeah.
I just it's one of the most fun times I had in a theater this decade, so it had to be on the list.
Then you put probably this is gonna be your most controversial one, actually, not even Mother, the Child's Play remake.
Yes.
Which is not the Don Mancini TV series that they just finally officially announced.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Oh, good for
them.
It
was officially announced. It's got its order. It's going to be on Sci-Fi.
No, this movie is a movie that was retrofitted Child's Play from a script that was more of a sort of horror comedy about like an Amazon Alexa-esque kind of a toy.
It's 100%. You couldn't. It's very clearly an evil Alexa movie that was turned into a Child's Play movie. It's amusingly obvious that they did this.
So I consider myself a fan of the first 4 Child's Play movies, and I do like the 5th Child's Play movie a little less. And then I have not seen the sort of reboot sort of series. So I'm not someone who was not there were people who were offended that this movie sort of disregarded the previous continuity that had been pretty active. It's not like they hadn't made a movie in a while. It was sort of an ongoing series that quickly got cut off by this remake that had very little to do with it. But for me, what this reminded me of was less Child's Play than like Full Moon movies. This had a very late 80s, early 90s direct-to-video PG-13 horror. Like it feels like a kid's movie, but just a really inappropriate one.
Yeah.
And it has like I really like the way it looks. It's very colorful in the way that those movies are in my memory. It has a very open tone in that it's willing to sort of be hilariously just dark and brutal and gory, but also very silly and just goofy. And then like there are parts of it that feel like Stranger Things, and then there are parts of it that feel like House of a Thousand Corpses.
Yeah.
And I just had a great time with it. I think it does the thing it does really well, even if the thing it does is not really Child's Play.
I think my biggest criticism is it just sort of ended very suddenly. It felt like it was building up to something, and that it like didn't quite get there for me. But yeah. I like a lot of things about this, and I'm not a huge Child's Play fan. I think it's fine. I've seen all of them now at this point. I think you were with me, the Music Box of Horror, when Don Mancini was interviewed about it, and he was clearly very upset that this movie existed. Yes. And I don't really blame him. But I think that they differentiated themselves quite a bit. And I like the new Chucky origin because he's not inherently evil.
No. He's just radicalized by horror movies.
Yeah, and well, not only that, but just like he's mistreated and he's doing his best. He's just fucking it up. And the funniest thing in the whole movie is at the very beginning. It's a literal. I don't know if they're doing this reference on purpose, but it's something that happens on an episode of The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror, where there's a Krusty doll that's tried to kill Homer, and it's accidentally been set to homicidal instead of nice.
Yeah.
And that's really what happens is at the beginning there's like this pseudo sweatshop in Vietnam, and the boss is being mean, and the guy purposely sets the Chucky doll to homicide.
He's like, before I go, real quick, I'm going to program sociopathy into this doll.
Just this one doll, and then that's it.
To show up my boss who will not know.
Yeah. And I thought, a lot of people complained about how off-putting the puppet was, but I thought that was a plus, personally.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that the movie made fun of how off-putting he was quite a bit. And I think the kills, I thought it was a PG-13 movie, but the kill scenes are very full moon. There's a Killer Clowns of Outer Space poster in the background in one scene. I think that's a good indication of what they were going for.
Yeah, I think the thing you mentioned about it being like so wildly different from the original series, it's like there's space for both, and I'm glad that Don Mancini got to make a Child's Play TV series and sort of continue whatever he was doing with those movies, which I haven't watched, so I don't know if they're good or bad. But like, I'm glad there's space for both of them.
In a weird roundabout way, that it feels like this particular script could have been retrofitted to either be a RoboCop reboot or a Child's Play reboot. And this movie actually seems to acknowledge that. There's all sorts of RoboCop jokes baked into the movie. Like,
I didn't put my finger on that, but that's a really interesting sort of parallel there. It does kind of feel like a Paul Verhoeven level of satire.
The idea that Alexa would turn homicidal is, Also, the one last thing is I think it would also be a good idea for maybe a Final Destination soft reboot. Is somehow Death gets trapped at Alexa and just starts using household objects to murder people.
There are definitely horror movies that take place in like high-tech houses or whatever. Or there's I feel like most killer elevator movies end up being killer elevator actually has complete control over the most high-tech skyscraper ever made or something.
Right.
So yeah, you could slot that into the Final Destination series just fine.
Well, and the thing is, those movies existed, but we do live in a time now where all that stuff is like not just real, but like normal. So I think it's okay to revisit something that, the killer house thing, which I think goes back to there's a Ray Bradbury story about a killer house. I can't remember what. It's something perfect for revisiting, and I look forward to more Killer Alexa movies. Even if they're reboots of franchises that, they didn't necessarily mean to be fit into. So moving on to something even more colorful, but very different. You have The Strange Color of Your Body's Tears.
I kind of think we should save this for when you do your list, because this is a movie that I think is one of the most spectacular looking movies I've ever seen in my life. Definitely one of the most spectacular looking movies of the decade. But it's also a movie that is obsessed with Italian horror in a way that I cannot access the way you can.
All right. No, that's cool. We'll save it because I put it on my list, so we'll save that from my list. Your next one is Tucker and Dale versus Evil. I did talk to my friend Betsy about this one at length.
Yeah, and I would just
I'll let you mention something.
When we talk about how all eras, you can look at this decade and say, yes, the 80s were hot, but like all eras are always with us. As soon as someone has a good idea, there's always going to be people bouncing against that good idea like moths to a light bulb,
Yep.
And so like this to me is another example of a Scream-inspired movie from this decade.
And then your next one, I'm afraid I could not find, so you're going to have to tell me about it.
Yes, so The Legend of Beaver Dam is a short film that 2010, 2010, so this is before it would ever have a chance to go viral, and it's a little too cute, I think, to ever... Yeah. It doesn't have that sort of bite that Lights Out does that makes you want to share it with someone. But it is a musical slasher movie about a kid who's picked on at summer camp. He's being teased about like this legend. It's basically Madman, the 1981 slasher movie, where they're talking about the legend of this evil spirit, Stumpy Sam. And then, of course, Stumpy Sam it's like if you say his name 3 times, he'll come and kill you with this knife. And the obnoxious camp counselor, who's played by this somewhat notable comedian, musical comedian, who I can't remember his name, but he plays guitar and does comedy. And then like all of a sudden heavy metal music kicks in, and Stumpy Sam, it turns into this like rock opera where Stumpy Sam is threatening everybody. And then the dorky kid comes back to fight him and save, and they have sort of a metal battle. And then there's sort of a twist that's maybe not so hard to see coming, where it's like, it's basically the twist. It's basically any given horror movie is going to have this twist. It's just a lot of fun. It is like 10 minutes long. It does all of its gags really well, and it's really goofy and silly, and it has a really kind of gleeful sense of gore. I don't know. The guy who did this, he went on to make Stage Fright, which is another slasher musical.
Yeah, which I haven't seen.
That I watched like the first 20 minutes or so of that, and I was not really so into it. I think maybe it's a premise that is more digestible in 10 minutes as opposed to 90.
Right.
But that's all. It's a really fun movie, and it used to be on YouTube, but sadly, it's one of those. It's in that sort of short film limbo where someone owns the rights to it, but no one has any ability to make money from owning the rights to it. So it's just nowhere. There was a really fantastic horror movie, short horror film called Bug Crush that is sadly in a similar state. Actually, you know what? Let me look up Bug Crush real quick, because if that's from this decade, then I screwed up and I should have included it.
Okay.
We're gonna pull a Jim. We're gonna rewrite the list as we're on the air. But in the meantime, that is no Bug Crush 2006. That's right.
Okay, we're good.
So that is the Legend of Beaver Dam.
And that brings us to the end of part 1. Sorry again about my health there. I didn't realize how stuffy my nose was until I heard the playback while editing. Stay tuned in about 2 weeks when you can listen to part 2, which should finish off Patrick's list and include about an hour with our friend Luana Saitta from the Kaiju episode. Until then, you have my permission to party like it's 1999.
Sing it with me now! Who's afraid of Stumpy Sam, the one-armed ghost of Beaver Dam? Who dares to say his name 3 times tonight? It's you two, come for you and kill you with his knife. Stumpy Sam, Stumpy Sam, Stumpy